see them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright blessed day, the dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry, I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Grace and peace to you from the one who was and is to come. Amen. We return to the text from last week in the Gospel of Mark. There's still so many layers of meaning to be discovered in what proves to be a short but incredibly dense and rich passage. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was exhausted and lying on the floor. She was filled with fire, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and raised her up. And the fire left her, and she began to serve them. That evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door. Fever or fire. We established that Peter's mother-in-law did not just have a fever, but was in fact burning or filled with fire. We looked at her condition in the context of the long and brutal war between Rome and the Jewish resistance. And we noticed how her fire of despair and silent protest also resonated with Amos's and Jeremiah's experience of fire. Her burning summoned Jesus to pay attention to what is happening on the ground in the aftermath of a devastating war. And taking into account the Matilda effect of how scientific achievements by women were either ascribed to men or devalued, we decided to call Peter's mother-in-law Matilda. She plays a central role in what has often been treated as an inconspicuous side story at the beginning of Mark's Gospel. The mother-in-law. Our focus this morning is on the second part of the story. How does Jesus pay attention to her, and what does her healing signal, not just to the people of Capernaum, but also to the readers of Mark's Gospel? We are in the house of Peter's mother-in-law. Does the lack of attention to her story by non-feminist scholars have something to do with a general prejudice towards mother-in-laws? There are plenty of mother-in-law jokes that illustrate society's stereotypes, casting her as generally rude, overbearing, meddling, and obnoxious. Some are offensively sexist, but also disrespectful of elders or parents. But the stereotypes remain pervasive. They tap into deep-seated fears about family dynamics, control, and the shifting of loyalties that often occur in marriage. The toxic mother-in-law becomes a convenient scapegoat for marital tensions and family conflicts. In our scriptures, mother-in-laws have a much better reputation. In the book of Ruth, the mother-in-law is held in high esteem and plays a central role in the family. It is the friendship of Naomi and Ruth that sustains the two women through loss, poverty, and migration. The mother-in-law is kissed and praised for what she did for her daughter-in-law. It is the mother-in-law who initiates the conversation and speaks out. Her perspective and wisdom guides the plot and expresses a deep concern for their shared well-being. This is why Ruth, the daughter-in-law, trusts Naomi to stay with her and returns to her. Matilda, Peter's mother-in-law, might have been the owner of the house. In this case, Peter will have moved into the house through marriage. She might have been a widow and therefore entitled to some financial support. We don't know if Peter moved in with her or if her own plight and need forced her to return to her hometown, as in the case of Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law. We remember Naomi struggling with God. In her desperation, she exclaims, "Don't call me Naomi, the pleasant one, but call me Mara, the bitter one, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." Does Naomi's fate shed further light on Matilda being filled with fire? Is she not only facing the devastation of war, but also the vulnerability of a widow? How is she to relate to her God in the midst of feeling humiliated and forsaken? Is God against her? We don't know enough to fully understand the situation of Peter's mother-in-law. She has no name, but is simply referred to as mother-in-law. What we notice is the fire of despair we talked about last week. Both Matilda and Naomi are living through tough times and are dependent on others for support and care. The Greek term for mother-in-law is pentera and derives from pentos, which means grief and sorrow. It indicates that the mother-in-law was seen to be the one taking responsibility for grief and sorrow in a family. She's known to be familiar with the customs, rituals, and songs needed to process hardship and loss in a family. The fact that Matilda is described as a mother-in-law might therefore not only indicate her status in the family, but also carry theological weight. She is the one in the family who models for everyone else how to deal with grief. She knows how heavy loss can be and how a community might be able to find its way through despair back to life. When Jesus enters the house with James and John, Peter and Andrew immediately tell him about Matilda's condition. So he went to her, took her hand, and raised her up. He took her hand. What are we witnessing in the story? How are we to imagine the scene of Jesus approaching Matilda? Is he sitting down next to her on the ground? We are first of all told that he takes her hand. Given the brevity of the text, it is rather surprising that Mark talks about her hands. Are her arms stretched out with hands grasping for support and comfort? Is she hoping for someone to pull her out of the fire? Her outstretched arms and hands take us back to the book of Lamentation, in which the city of Zion is portrayed as a woman desperate to be heard and seen. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is no one to comfort her. The book's songs of lament give witness to how hard the city's population was hit by the war. The Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in 597 BCE. Zion is on the ground, unconsolable and crying for her children. Not only has the city been set on fire, but the fire is also burning in Zion's innermost being, leaving her alone and ill. This is why I weep, and my eyes overflow with tears. No one is near to comfort me, no one to restore my spirit. Zion stretches out her hands, but there is no one to comfort her. See, Lord, how distressed I am. Everything within me smolders. In my heart I am disturbed. Outside the sword bereaves, inside there's only death. Just like Zion, Matilda finds herself on the ground, stretching out her hands, seeking not only her own consolation, but the comfort of the whole town of Capernaum. The victory coins Rome distributed throughout the empire sent out a clear message. We see a woman sitting or lying on the ground in the sand. Her hands are often bound and the head is covered. Beside her stands a Roman soldier in military tunic. The proud palm tree at his side signified ownership of the land in all its produce. The woman sitting on the ground symbolized Judea, defeated and humiliated. The coin reads Judea capta, Judea is captured. Rome's war crimes were never investigated. No perpetrator was ever sentenced. Just like Zion, Matilda finds herself on the ground, stretching out her hands. But this time someone hears and sees her. Someone is sitting with her in the fire and taking her hands. Jesus is receiving her wailing with hands willing to hold her pain. Zion's longing for a comforter is finally answered. There is at least one sympathetic witness who allows himself to be touched by her trauma and pain. He will not let go of her hands until she's able to rise again. What does it mean to offer comfort in the aftermath of a war? Lucia Sutter-Rehmann once again takes us to Carmine Abbate's novel, The Hills of the Wind. We do not only hear about the mother's fire of despair, mourning the violent death of her sons. The father has also lost the courage to live and has been bedridden for years. He cannot get up and go outside. But one day, his grandchildren take the initiative, refusing to leave him in peace. The grandfather looked at her in confusion, as if he didn't recognize her or could hear a threat in her words. In a sepulchral voice, he announced, "I'm already dead." Michelangelo furrowed his brows worriedly. "We are all dead," the old man added. The girl burst out laughing. No, grandfather, don't talk nonsense. Dead people can't talk. The dead talk more than the living. That's enough now. Ninabella pinched his arm so hard that the old man jumped. "Ouch, have you gone mad?" To which she replied glibly, "The dead don't feel pain." She threw his blankets aside and asked her brother for help. Together, with endless patience, they pulled the grandfather out of his bed, helped him get dressed, and led him out into the alley. The grandchildren refused to leave their grandfather in peace. Their affectionate teasing reveals their insistent innocence that slowly draws him back into life. They take action, hold his hand, pull him out of his bed, raise him up, and help him to get dressed. Slowly, they lead him out into the streets. The famous British sculptor Henry Moore did a series of drawings of his own hands to describe the aged and fragile body. He was 81 and suffering from ill health. He's fascinated by the expressive power and versatility of the human hand. There's an eloquence to the human hand that he tries to capture. Hands speak, and his skillful renderings invite us to sense the tremendous power of the hand to convey human emotions. Moore once commented on his fascination with hands. After the head and face, hands are the most expressive part of the human body. Hands can convey so much. They can beg or refuse, take or give, be open or clenched, show content or anxiety. They can be young or old, beautiful or deformed. Throughout the history of sculpture and painting, one can find that artists have shown through their hands the feelings they wish to represent. Rembrandt, for example, uses hands to express nearly as much as the head and its features. The nearest model is one's own hands. Again, given the brevity of the biblical passage, it is rather surprising that Mark mentions taking Matilda's hands. We have seen how this detail connects her fire of despair with the book of Lamentation and a whole city reaching out their hands in desperate need for comfort. So he went to her, took her hand, and raised her up. Human beings can comfort and raise one another up. Jesus must have immediately understood what is going on. We don't know if he said anything. There's certainly nothing spectacular about this healing. He simply takes her hands and holds them. The silence in the text opens up space for the first readers and listeners to think about their own painful truth. The story could have ended there, but it doesn't. It continues. She who feels fully seen and heard in her pain receives more than comfort. Jesus raises her up, and the fire leaves her. This might very well have been the very first time that Jesus experienced himself as a channel of God's healing power. A young man begins to slowly discover his ability to heal people. He realizes that he can be a gift to others. All he does is to take Matilda's hands and raise her up. God's power is flowing through him. He becomes a channel of God's power and grace, which begins to flow in the moment of physical connection. Are we not invited to become more open and sensitive to the healing that can happen between two human beings who become present to each other? Does this moment of connection not convey a dimension of reality that can easily be missed? A more holistic approach to healing reminds us to never underestimate the healing power of human intimacy and connection. Nowadays, we are also more aware of psychosomatic symptoms, which make us think of illness and healing in a more holistic way. Psychosomatic pain can be induced by excessive stress or mental health challenges, affecting the body and its immune system. Identifying the causes of mental stress becomes an important part of the healing process. Given the context of violence and war, the first readers and listeners will have experienced themselves severe trauma. Remember, the whole town is gathering outside the door of her house the very same evening. Matilda's healing will have been an encouragement to them to find strength in healing, in being there for one another, and to seek community. God's power and grace seems to be present whenever people turn towards one another and dare to be present to the pain. As readers and listeners, we are asked to see with the heart, for only the heart is able to see what remains hidden to our eyes. We usually struggle to find the right words to give expression to these kind of experiences. The space in between human beings is difficult to grasp. It can be about a tender touch that makes its way into the heart. The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber tried to put this experience into words when he said, "Through the touch of each you, a breath of eternal life touches us." We are to imagine God as power in relationship. In other words, we're encouraged to no longer imagine God as an invisible person, but as a form of power that is effective between human beings and in between energy. God happens in between people. In other words, God is a verb. We should be more curious about this God who is present, a verb becoming real and tangible in the in-between spaces that make up our relationships. Touch can take many forms. Physical touch might not always be appropriate. It matters who is taking the initiative. But can we not also expect such flow of energy when listening or dancing to a song, swimming through the forest, receiving a precious word of affirmation, or witnessing an act of kindness? Do we believe that God is present and active in all those in-between spaces? Do we dare to trust and reach out to what promises to be a source of strength and healing? We witness a brief moment of empathy and touch that brings light into Matilda's darkness. It is an intimate encounter. It carries a message that will have traveled from far away, the depths of one's soul or the heights of heaven. While people might forsake us or turn against us, this God is committed to help us get through the terror of violence and war, illness and hardship, trauma and pain. And then he raised her up. The Greek idiom employed to describe this moment of raising her is the same verb used to describe Jesus' resurrection in the Gospel of Mark. It is this moment of connection that quenches Matilda's fire of despair. She's able to stand up again and return to life. She's raised from a sea of fire that almost consumed her. She's the first to do so in the Gospel. She's the first to be resurrected. In the Gospel of Mark, every healing story is a small resurrection, and the resurrection is one big healing story. And in the same way that her fire echoes the suffering of a whole town, her resurrection inspires everyone to gather outside the door of her house. The story becomes a wonderful overture to the whole Gospel of Mark, culminating in Jesus' own resurrection. But again, the story does not end here. And the fire left her, and she began to serve them. We are told that she began to serve them. Such serving is traditionally interpreted as waiting on them. Is she basically getting up, putting on an apron, and starting to serve food to the disciples as an expression of gratitude? Thanks to a study by Elizabeth Schüssler-Fiorenza, female serving can no longer be distinguished from male serving in the New Testament and early Christianity. The Apostle Paul described himself as a servant using the same Greek word that is employed to describe Matilda's service. And just because Matilda is a woman does not mean that her act of service should be limited to household work and the kitchen. We have to move away from traditional, patriarchally inscribed roles of domestic servitude to more non-traditional, egalitarian roles of discipleship. The Greek term diakonein signals discipleship and carries theological weight. It is the central keyword in Mark's conception of discipleship as a service, and Matilda exemplifies such a model of Christian discipleship. She begins to minister and become an example of an early disciple. In fact, the whole Gospel of Mark testifies to the presence and importance of women in the early Jesus movement. And Matilda's serving constitutes somewhat an exception, because this story is the only one in Mark's Gospel in which the healing of an ill person is followed by a concrete and positive response towards Jesus. How did she serve them then? The scene comes immediately after the visit to the synagogue. It is the Sabbath, and on the Sabbath you are not allowed to work. It was forbidden to cook or to make fire, to fetch water or to clean vegetables. You were also not allowed to prepare the table. All of this is done the day before. And then, as soon as the sun has set, on Friday evening the celebration of the Sabbath would begin. So it is impossible that Matilda could have possibly served the disciples food. That would have been a serious offense and transgression of the Sabbath laws. What we read is that after sunset, after the official end of the Sabbath, everyone brought their sick relatives and friends to the house of the mother-in-law. What we can therefore assume is that Matilda, together with the other disciples, will have shared the news of the new life she received from Jesus with the people of her village. And in the course of time, her house might have become a place of gathering for a house church, which she herself led. We know that both women and men were heading small house churches in the early church. They both served Jesus as deacons and were equally respected for their leadership. We are once again reminded of the Matilda effect and its negative impact on how the role of women in the early church was conceived. Not only was the name of Peter's mother-in-law forgotten, her suffering and her service were made small and insignificant by male scholars. It is interesting to note that in Mark's Gospel, the Greek idiom for serving is used for the first time at the end of Jesus' 40-day stay in the desert. We read about angels serving him, and those angels will certainly not have served tea and cake. Angels are rather messengers who are there for Jesus in his need. They are meant to protect and strengthen him. In other words, Matilda does exactly what the angels did. She shares the good news of Jesus' ministry and manages to mobilize the whole village to come and meet him. This is how the story ends. Outside of Matilda's house, the people of Capernaum meet the one who is able to comfort and resurrect them to a new life in hope. She who experienced the power of resurrection herself is committed to sharing it with those still filled with the fire of despair. Be inspired by Matilda's witness to the power of resurrection and go out to be a channel of God's grace and love. And for this ministry, God bless you and keep you. God's face shine upon you and be gracious to you. God's face be turned towards you and grant you peace. Amen.
Tu mamina,